Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss my final thoughts or pre-thoughts on what the main points are regarding the Privileges Committee investigation into Boris Johnson's lies ahead of his hearing, which will begin 2 hours after this video is published. Essentially, this is about the main points which I will be looking for answers to in the hearing. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I want to go over the main thrust of what Johnson's arguments are, I suppose, but how they're not really any defence at all. But I'm very curious about how the committee are going to pin him down. One way in which Johnson is attempting to defend himself is by saying he thought the gatherings were fine at the time. He says, for example, why would he have had the official photographer take photos if he didn't think they were fine? And of course, we've seen the photos from the Sue Gray report. That's not people randomly snapping pics on their mobile phones. Those pictures were leaked to the papers which started off the Partygate scandal. You know, this is supposed to be his gotcha for the committee. Why would I have recorded my crimes then if I thought I was breaking the law? Falls down somewhat when you point out that criminals are caught all the time by recording their crime sprees and posting it online, because some people are just idiots. But that works out for Johnson, because his main defence is that he is an idiot who cannot recognise a social gathering when he sees one, much less is part of one. But as to the defence that he photographed the events, which he would not have done so if he thought there was something wrong, there are two problems with this defence. First, the photos weren't published, were they? I mean, quite often when you've got the official photographer taking photos of something, it's for a purpose. It's to say, oh, look at this. You know, there was no, oh, so-and-so's leaving. We had a little drinky-doos to see them off. There was no publication of these photographs until, of course, there was an investigation into Partygate. You know, isn't that you being aware that you really shouldn't be publicising what you did? All these photos of all these parties, not a single one of them was ever used officially, never published. Isn't that an indication that because that's what I would ask him if he tries to come up with that defence today? I would say, so why were none of them published if you thought it was fine? Why were none of them actually used? Secondly, the committee is not investigating what Boris Johnson believed at the time of the parties. That was for Sue Gray and the police to sort out. They are investigating, the Privileges Committee are investigating what Boris Johnson believed at the time he made his statements to the House of Commons, and for the period of time from then until he finally admitted the truth in the House of Commons. That's it. You know, they're not trying to investigate the parties as such, or whether they broke the law, or what happened. No. They're only investigating whether or not he believed what he said when he said it to the House of Commons from December 2021 to May 2022. Makes no difference what he thought was acceptable in 2020 if, when he was making his statements to MPs much later on, he'd come to realise that these parties were a definite no-no, and I could probably deliver a full lecture course on critiquing Johnson's various defences, and a lawyer could do much more. But for me, his general defence falls down in three key areas. First, he keeps trying to reframe what the investigation is about. He talks about what he thought at the time of the parties, for example. Nothing to do with the investigation. And if he's too stupid to understand that, and I suspect he's not, but he is claiming to be, I'm sure his incredibly clever lawyers pointed it out to him. So this deliberate attempt to keep convincing people that the investigation is about something else entirely is an indication that Johnson cannot fight the actual allegations, so he pretends to fight different ones. The second problem is that he's placing so much of his defence on the notion of what might or might not be obvious to him personally. He's basically saying that the committee can't possibly know what is obvious to him. But even in a court of law, they consider how a reasonable person reacts, don't they? But the committee is not a court of law, it's a parliamentary committee. They can absolutely take a view that on the balance of probability, Boris Johnson would have known that the parties were illegal at the time because it was bleeding obvious. And much more relevantly, be aware that the rules were broken when he was making his parliamentary statements much later on, after he'd talked to his top advisors. And we have records of those top advisors saying that they knew that these events were totally unlawful. Utterly ridiculous to suggest that they hadn't told him. The third problem is that Boris Johnson is relying upon the witness statements of people who were not only at the parties, so implicated themselves, but helped organise them and organise Johnson's concealment of them. It's like a bank robber presenting witness statements from the rest of their criminal gang. You know, in his hearing today, Johnson's going to claim two idiot defences. The first is that it's unreasonable for the committee to suggest that it should have been obvious to him that the gatherings were legal. He's trying to argue that he might be such an idiot that even though on an almost daily basis he was explaining the rules to members of the public, that somehow he didn't understand his own words. The second idiot defence is his claim that the committee can't prove that his officials told him rules were being broken. But we have seen very detailed communications of those officials discussing with each other that these events were clearly against the rules and trying to come up with excuses to allow them to say that they were within the rules. The defence rests on the notion that it is impossible to have understood the rules unless a senior civil servant explained it to you in an email, which begs the question, how were the rest of the country supposed to know what the rules meant to them? And even this defence is nonsense. As I say, numerous records of senior officials discussing the parts with one another and saying that they don't believe they fall within the rules. Johnson seems to be trying to claim that none of his advisors advised him of the conversations they were having with each other, even when Partygate became the number one political issue being discussed in the media. It's worth pointing out that Johnson is not actually going to attempt to prove his innocence at the hearing, because Boris Johnson has no chance of proving his innocence. I mean, that's all there is to it. There's no way. Even with the evidence that is now a matter of public record, he's clearly guilty. The aim of the game here for Boris Johnson is avoiding consequences. That's it. That is all there is to it. There was a suggestion that he's not going to get the 10-day suspension, which I think might be jumping the gun a bit, but I'll discuss that at the weekend, I think. But that's all he's after. If you were to tell him right now, you'll get like a 6-day suspension, he'll go, oh, okay, I'll go through the motions today then, but other than that's fine. I'm fine with that. I'll go off to America and make another couple of $1 million. You know, he wants to avoid consequences. For that, he needs a weak point to apply pressure to. We know he's guilty. It's obvious he's guilty. The public know he's guilty. So that's not an element of speculation. He's guilty. The only elements of speculation, as I see it, are as follows. First, how guilty is he? In other words, what length suspension would fit the seriousness of the offences? Given that he's not just guilty of the offences being investigated, and there's no way the committee will come to any other conclusion, but also of unfairly maligning the reputation of Parliament itself, I would argue very guilty. But I'm not qualified or in a position to say, is he guilty enough to warrant a 10-day suspension? I am just like the rest of you. I will think in terms of natural justice. I will think of suspensions or where other MPs have been suspended for 10 days or more and thought they were serious, but they weren't as serious as this. That's what I would think. But I am not an expert on the process. Second, are the committee feeling any pressure to be lenient? Now, I don't want to malign any member of the committee, but it is made up of a majority of Tory MPs, and there will be considerable pressure on them from within some quarters of their party, and the membership of their party and the media that basically bats for their party. Third, can Johnson pressure Tory MPs to reject the suspension if the committee is not lenient and the suspension is for 10 days or more? Now, I don't think that is at all likely. I don't think that can happen. I think his best weak point is number 2. But anyway, that's my view. Even if he could prove that he wasn't told by officials that he'd lied in Parliament, and he's expending an awful lot of his defence on doing just that, he still has to prove that he genuinely thought the events were lawful and at the time he made the statements, not the time he had the parties themselves. But this seems doubtful because although the mainstream media are not reminding us of what Johnson has said throughout the process, some of us remember because we paid careful attention. When the Partygate story first broke, Johnson denied, for example, that cheese and wine dues at Downing Street had taken place. Then, when evidence emerged that he denied knowing about them. He said he was appalled. He was absolutely appalled to hear that these things were going on. And this is when he tried to claim that Downing Street was so vast that he couldn't be everywhere at once, and it's possible to have had these cheese and wine dues without him ever knowing. Right? So he was outraged that they'd happened. Then photos emerged of Boris Johnson at these events. So then he switched his defence to, oh yeah, I was at the well, actually, yeah, but these were fine. These were perfectly lawful. They complied with the rules. But he'd previously denied that the gatherings had even taken place, or that he'd known about them. If you were to put to Boris Johnson the claims he said, certain statements he said, just chained together, you couldn't possibly believe a word he says. You know, if he thought the gatherings were lawful, why didn't he say so in winter 2021 when the news broke? Why did he deny they'd taken place? Why didn't he just say, oh, these things you're talking about were really, food and drink wasn't banned under the law, which is true. Food and drink was not banned under the law. Gatherings were banned. But he could have said the gatherings were reasonably necessary for the purpose of work. You know, the gatherings took place, but they were necessary for the purpose of work. They were not a primarily social activity. That's what he could have said. It would still have been a lie, but he could have said that, and he didn't. And actually, if he'd have come out with some things like that earlier on, it may never have got to this investigation. The reason this investigation ended up coming about is just because he lied and then told a different lie and a different lie. And he ended up looking like a 4-year-old child trying to pretend that he hasn't stolen the cookies when he's got crumbs all over his jumper. Why didn't he just say there were gatherings? Yes, there was alcohol and food, but there's nothing wrong with that. But they were reasonably necessary for work, if that's what he genuinely thought. He didn't. He lied based on the evidence that was published at the time. And I said at the time, when Partygate was first coming out, I said in a video, I distinctly remember, he's been trapped here. He's been trapped. He's coming up with lies that just cover the facts as known. He's not considering that someone has other facts and they're waiting for him to commit himself before leaking those facts to the media as well. Or if the media already have them, before the media publish them. And that is exactly what happened. Every time he told a lie, something was published that proved he was lying. So he came up with another lie. That's why this investigation ended up occurring. Because he didn't think to himself, what else is going to come out? Let's come up with a master lie that covers everything. You know, David Alan Green, a constitutional legal expert, I think he's put it best. He describes the process as following. There was no ball. If there was a ball, there was no window. If there was a window, it was not broken. If the window was broken, it was not by the ball. Okay, yes, I broke the window with my ball, but in good faith. That is Johnson's defence in a nutshell. Feeble defences that can only possibly work on this small number of people who have a very tribal mindset in Johnson's favour and are not remembering or looking up the sequence of events. Even the political editor of the Daily Mail, Dan Hodges, was poking holes all over Johnson's defence earlier this week. An indication, by the way, that Tory editors haven't been told to close ranks around Johnson. In fact, the Daily Telegraph also published an article that was a very forthright attack on Johnson. Don't get me wrong, all these usual suspects, including the Mail and Telegraph, are also publishing articles stoking the witch hunt narrative as well. They're taking both sides. They don't care about the damage being done to politics. They only care about sensationalism. So they're covering both sides here. But what we're not seeing is an attempt by the media to fall in line behind Johnson. They are attacking as freely as they are defending. Probably their idea of balance. But if political journalists and commentators and goodness knows who can find obvious holes in his arguments, I'm going to guess the committee is more than capable. On the Privileges Committee, you've got a former police detective, a former solicitor, and a senior barrister. I think they've got the members to critically evaluate defence. And how ridiculous must it be to even attempt to base your entire defence around whether or not officials told you you were breaking your own laws? I mean, can everyone who was fined during the lockdowns appeal on the basis that a senior civil servant hadn't hitherto told them they were breaking the law? No, because ignorance is no excuse. And if ignorance of the law is no excuse, it is especially no excuse to the head of government who made those laws and who personally explained them in fine detail with examples to the public in televised statements to the nation on multiple occasions. In fact, because Boris Johnson was explaining to the public what the rules were on an almost daily basis, you would actually consider Boris Johnson to have been one of the foremost experts on the rules in the whole country. The idea that he just didn't understand them is ludicrous. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Have more tomorrow. Will have to be tomorrow because his hearing will still be going on when my 5 o'clock video comes out, and that's going to be PMQs because he's not elbowing that out of the way. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button, and if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.